illustration by Dr. Nour Halabi, who is the Assistant Professor of Media and Communication at University of Leeds. So just a little bit about Dr. Nour. Dr. Nour is the Assistant Professor of Media and Communication at the University of Leeds. Her research examines the interaction between mobility, social movements, and media. She's also the author of Radical Hospitality, American Policy, Media, and Immigration, as well as other publications that examine global and media, including discourses in action. The special, like one of actually her publication also is the Special Politics of the Syrian Revolution and Middle East Critique that was published in 2019. And also, if these walls could speak, borders and walls as communicative devices in interventions during 2018. And she also received her doctorate from the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania, master's from the London School of Economics, and bachelor's from Paris Sorbonne. Welcome, Dr. Nour. It's our pleasure that you are here today with us for this amazing evening.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I really look forward to speaking to everyone. I'm very humbled by that introduction, actually. It's very nice to see people engage with my work. And I do it very much for the people who are like me. So it's really nice to see people in the Middle East, as well as academic institutions, reputable academic institutions in the Middle East engaging with my work. So with that, I'll say that I'm honored to be presenting my book to you, Radical Hospitality. This is my first book, and it is a book that very much focuses on American policy, but actually draws a larger argument about media ethics, journalistic ethics, and the ethics of how societies could re-encounter the other or the immigrant or the stranger that arrives at their shores. At the core of the book and the issue that I was trying to tackle with the project is looking at the issues within American, but also global North journalism in terms of how the issue of immigration and race is treated. So here, this is an example from a presidential debate in the United States, where Chris Wallace, who is a very reputable journalist in the United States, he has a long history of prominent journalistic appointments, evidenced by the fact that he was hosting the presidential debate. And he asked both candidates, why should voters trust you rather than your opponent to deal with the race issues facing this country over the next 4 years? Now, the way this question is phrased indicates one of the biggest problems in the United States at the moment, but throughout the global North, is that the issue of race becomes a problem of the other person, and that the figure of the other, the Black, brown body, becomes the place, the site in which the issue, the problem of race is represented or takes place, as opposed to setting our attention more on xenophobia, on racism being the problem. So instead of asking the candidates, why should voters trust you to face the issue of racism, we ask our candidates, why should we trust you to face the issue of race? As if the existence of race, the entirety of people coming from very different racial backgrounds is the problem. This is something that also transfers to a long-standing reflection that has taken place in the United States, but also globally in the conversation on race and ethnicity, specifically issues of Blackness. We have Du Bois, who's a very prominent thinker, also for a while based at my former institution, UPenn, who asked, how does it feel to be a problem? And here he is reflecting this idea that being Black, navigating the world as a Black man, becomes sort of an experience of understanding that your body, your entire existence becomes the site of the problem of race. Of course, he's not agreeing, he is critiquing in asking this question. This then, we can draw sort of a direct line between how societies treat the question of race and how societies treat the question of immigration, particularly as, and I talk about that more in my book, particularly as the problem of immigration actually began to arise when immigrants became predominantly Black and brown bodies. So I start to show at the beginning of my book how when immigration was primarily white Anglo-Saxon immigration or European immigration into the United States, there was no question of the problem of immigration. Actually, with the introduction of greater otherness and specifically racial otherness, that is when we began to talk about the problem of immigration. And so we can draw a line between the treatment of race and the treatment of immigration. And here we see this in the question that Derrida asks. And here for the folks who speak foreign languages besides English as their first language, note how when you translate a language, you don't capture the complexity of its meaning. So Derrida initially asked this question in French, and he plays on this idea that the word étranger in French means both foreigner, stranger, abroad, coming from abroad, but also everything that is different, that is unacceptable, that is not natural to everyone. And here he plays on that wordplay to ask, isn't the question of l'étranger, meaning the foreigner or the stranger, is a question that comes from l'étranger, abroad, but also what he's trying to indicate here is that double entendre of not only coming from abroad, but coming from the figure of the migrant. And so here the conversation within global media begins to frame as the migrant as the person who, with their arrival at our shores, with their arrival at the airport, with their mere existence begins to create the problem of immigration in society. One of the things that I was very interested in when doing my work is that this language that problematizes the migrant, that dehumanizes the migrant, that makes them the site of the problem for society is so normalized that oftentimes immigrant communities have now internalized that language. So here, I'm a scholar, obviously, of media. I'm very interested in media discourse. So I almost always collect any newspaper article that I read. And if you see here, this is a news article published in Arab News, directed at migrant and would-be migrant communities of Arab origin, where the journalist is saying, don't think that your problems end by arriving. Don't think that migration will solve all your problems. Actually, in migration, once you arrive, you are likely to be a forever problem. And the language is, of course, I'm not pointing fingers at the journalist here. This is a pervasive language throughout migrant communities, migrant media coverage, is that this language of problematizing the migrant or making the migrant stand in for all issues of society has been so pervasive, it's so widespread that even migrants themselves have taken to speaking about themselves in these ways. And that is what I try to fight against with this book. So I look at hospitality as a lens through which we can reframe the conversation on immigration. Interestingly, hospitality is unique in the fact that it occupies a universally positive position. So any culture I looked at, any religious doctrine that I looked at, any religious background that I looked at, any linguistic background that I looked at, everywhere I looked, east to west, north to south, hospitality occupies a positive position, a positive normative position in which we see the hospitality of the person hosting a guest as an indicator of their relationship with the divine, as an indicator of their moral uprightness, as a visible indicator of their general goodness, of their participation in cultural norms, from Karam al-Arab to French hospitality. So I saw this as a conceptual framework that is not only one that shifts moral responsibility away from the victim of xenophobia, of anti-immigrant sentiment, of racial discriminatory treatment in migration, to the figure of the person who is exercising anti-immigrant, inhospitable ideas. So in my book, I define this concept of hospitality that I'm trying to introduce. as one that denotes a relationship between a host who has developed an identity that is spatially anchored in a place, and thus seen as belonging to it and possessing authority over it, and a guest who enters the host domain and whose identity is perceived to be tied to other places. I talk more, of course, in the book about hospitality elements. So not only this broad definition, but what is hospitality when it's practiced from, for example, pathways to settling and legal settlement, pathways to work and being able to support yourself, to openness to the culture of the guest who arrives, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot more detail here about how I treat hospitality in the book, but for the purpose of brevity and for the purpose of just introducing you to the topic, I'm focusing here just on the definition. The case for hospitality is really interesting in the sense that I believe that by framing migration within this ethical framework of hospitality, not only do we shift our focus away from the victim to the perpetrator of injustice, but we also are able to reveal aberrations or injustices in patterns of how migration and movement have been treated in the past. And actually, I start my book with a chapter called Poisoned Beginnings that really reflects how we need to fix these aberrations before we can begin to talk about contemporary migration. So I do this by framing migration as a dyadic relationship between host and guest. And I argue that framing it in that way allows us to make more visible the injustice of settler colonialism and the injustice of slavery, and not only that, but the connection between those injustices and the way immigration is treated. To make that a bit more clear, let's look at this rudimentary visual that I've made to kind of serve this purpose. If we begin to understand settler colonialism within the context of host and guest relationships, these dyads, these two sort of category or party relationships, we begin to understand how in settler colonialism, the relationship of the host and guest disintegrates from host and guest to the host becoming the hostage and the guest taking over the position of the host and assuming ownership of the space. Now, the position of the hostage is really difficult because the hostage now loses their humanity, loses their cultural heritage. There's all sorts of types of genocide-related activities that are related to settler colonialism that I talk about more in the book in relation to the United States, in relation to Native American and First Nations that inhabited Northern America. Similarly, if we begin to understand immigration in the sense of these dyadic relationships and frame these two instances as such, we begin to also understand the slave trade as another disintegration of American immigration hospitality. This is a situation where, by this point, the European settler colonial host has now solidly affirmed themselves as a host. And they now bring in a guest who is not fully a guest, who is a hostage. These are people who were brought against their will, who were denied their liberty, their freedom, who were taken away from their families, from their children, who were forced to do unpaid, very difficult labor. We all know the sort of very brutal circumstances of slavery. And I talk about that a lot more in the book, about the sort of very violent elements of how, when immigration hospitality disintegrates in this way, we build a violent history that we need to interrogate. Now, why is it important to talk about these poisoned beginnings? And why am I beginning a conversation on immigration by talking about settler colonialism and slave trade? This is because we cannot fix immigration hospitality now without addressing the fact that the foundations of American immigration hospitality, but in fact, any settler colonial nation, for example, Australia, as a place where these foundations are poisoned. And in order to address injustice in the current moment, we need to address the fact that historically, from the very beginning, Black and brown bodies, all non-white bodies, were treated as less deserving of guest and host sort of hospitality treatment and disintegrated into these relationships. Of course, there are many limitations to the concept of hospitality. I am not in any way deceived about the problems that hospitality as a framework presents, and yet I still think it is important. However, some of the limitations are that hospitality in the end, and I talk about this a lot more in the book, represents an unequal relationship of spatially anchored power. Even when we are saying hospitality, we are acknowledging that host societies have some sort of authority over space through which they can then extend hospitality. There is an emphasis on difference and otherness that Josinas talks about in conversations on hospitality that is not negligible, but also very important to keep in mind when we're having this conversation. And Subh and Wilson also point out that hospitality is a relationship of alterity, i.e. a relationship of difference between two communities. Nevertheless, I talk a lot more in the book about how, however we frame things within the context of us having the current Westphalian nation state system, there's no escaping that relationship of belonging that comes with living in a space over time. And in fact, if anyone's familiar with my previous work, I know, Shireen, you pointed out my work on ancient walls. I've worked on ancient walls in Damascus and how continuously inhabiting the space within the walls of Damascus for the communities who have lived there for centuries means that they feel an intense belonging to that place. Now, this is not a border, but it denotes a sort of belonging. So even within societies, we cannot neglect this idea that living in a place for a very long time begins to give us a sense of feeling of belonging and feeling of authority over space that we can then use to extend hospitality. So how is hospitality then exercised? So I talk a lot in the book about hospitality being manifested in two very important realms with respect to how the immigrant is treated. One is in the laws, so how the laws treat the immigrant, whether they allow them transparent laws that they can understand, whether the law provides pathways to citizenship, pathways to working, so on and so forth. And also how the media treats the immigrant. So does the media speak about the immigrant fairly, i.e. sort of faithfully and honestly? Does the media represent immigrants as human beings? So you'll see in the book, there's some very disgusting historical precedents of comparing immigrants to different animals, pigs and monkeys and so on and so forth. So we really get to see in the book how media specifically played a role in dehumanizing immigrants. And this doesn't begin now. And one of the arguments I talk about is how looking at history is a restorative process. We cannot fix the problems of now by simply looking in a presentist sense at this moment. We really need to look at the historical development of a field, specifically how journalism has developed as well. In the different chapters of my book, I attend to different periods of American immigration. And I specifically pick these periods because they're representative of certain themes that recur across US immigration history, but also global immigration history and hospitality history. So here, the first period I looked at was the 1880s, during which the United States passed what's called the Chinese Exclusion Act, banning Chinese immigrants from arriving in the United States. During this time, I draw attention to what's called medicalized nativism. And again, there's this connection. So when we saw, for example, the demonization of Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans who had been there for generations, following COVID-19, and a president who was calling a global pandemic the Kung Fu flu as a joke. These are all connections across time from the very earliest instances in which diseases were connected to immigrants to the current moment. I also talk about how Chinese immigrants were labeled as barbarians, how they were accused of poor hygiene, and how there was a demonization of their different languages, their culinary traditions, and so on and so forth. And there's a lot of connection between then and now. I talk a lot about news articles that it depicted these trends, and there is a lot in the book that looks at specifically the role that political cartoon played. So there's a lot of political cartoons in the book. I will save you from the worst one that is really dehumanizing to look at, but it compares Chinese immigrants to pigs and suggests that Chinese immigrants are actually a less evolved version of the pig, drawing on Darwin's theory of evolution, which was very prominent at the time. So you see how the media really played a role in dehumanizing immigrants. I then look at the 1920s, and I look at how during this time, we saw an intensification and increase in the conversation on medicalized nativism. It became a conversation in which all the diseases that are currently going through the world are blamed on immigrants. Oh, it must be the immigrants that are bringing in typhoid, et cetera, et cetera. Immigrants were also then connected to all social ills, diseases, inferior genes, what was called the mongrelization of the American race, i.e. the mixing of the American race, disloyalty and anarchism. And you'll see how this issue of disloyalty and anarchism is very important as we look at the next chapter. And also here's something that isn't spoken about too much, is this period in the 1920s was a period where we saw the rise of eugenics, i.e. the race science that purported to rank races based on how inferior or developed they were. Of course, this has all been debunked since, but this eugenics movement was central to the rise of Nazi German thought. So again, no one really makes that connection, but a lot of the sources of fascism at the time came from books that were actually published in the United States, some of which Hitler had written about and called his Bible. So these were really important parts of the conversation on immigration, but also the conversation around the world on fascism and xenophobia and fear of the other. So this is part of what I look at in the 1920s. Then I move on to post 9/11. So here again, there is a link, and this is why I talk about how you cannot fix the contemporary moment without looking at the past. When we look at post 9/11, we see all the characteristics of anti-immigrant sentiment that appeared in the past. So when in the 1920s, we were accusing immigrants of harboring different undesirable political affinities, this intensified post 9/11. So all immigrants were seen as associating with undesirable political affinities. This came from the 1920s and intensified then. And this was particularly, as you can imagine, especially with this audience, I feel like everyone's very familiar with this conversation. This was particularly targeted at Muslims and immigrants coming from the Middle East, but also, let me say this, immigrants who appear to come from the Middle East. So if you are Indian but appear Middle Eastern, there wasn't enough education about what a Sikh looked like. And so there was quite a lot of violence towards anyone who looked Middle Eastern during that period. I talk a lot in the book about the archival research that I did on the newspapers that covered this moment, particularly the New York Times and the Washington Post. And I talk about certain themes that emerge in how Muslims specifically were represented. firstly as hard enemies. So oftentimes they were represented as enemies that we can never vanquish. We can never solve the fact that Muslims will always hate us. They were seen also, they were represented as enemies that targeted soft targets. So there was a lot of journalistic coverage of Muslims will target preschools or schools or children, again, whether there's evidence or not, but this constant focus on all of that. And then finally, the inability to see Muslims as victims. So anytime there was a huge increase in not only sort of Islamophobic sentiment, but violence directed at Muslims or people who looked Muslim, but there was an inability to see them as victims because there's an inability to now see their humanity based on this coverage. All of that I cover in that chapter, which brings us to a happier moment, ironically, a happier moment. And that is the passage of the Muslim ban. This is actually the closing of my book. It happened as I was writing in many ways, but it denotes a very stark contradiction within American immigration and perhaps its future. Ironically, although the Muslim travel ban represented one of the peak moments of not only Islamophobic sentiment, but anti-immigrant sentiment and injustice towards immigrants, it also then provided a turning point within public discussion of immigration. So we saw during that time, and I cover a lot more in the book about how the public began to speak about Muslim immigrants as victims of injustice. They began to counter the narrative that we had seen in the media for many years now. And they began to have conversations in which there was a shift from looking at these immigrants as threats to looking at these immigrants as people that we should have compassion for, who are victims, who must be protected, and we must extend hospitality to. And I talk a lot more in the book about how when I interview people who are witnessing this moment, so although the Trump administration had passed some extremely restrictive laws directed towards immigrants at the time, we saw people from every walk of life, from every religion, at almost every airport and port of entry in the United States, showing up with banners and chanting, "Let them in." And it was a very emotional moment for some of the people I interviewed who were Muslim, witnessing anyone showing up at an airport and yelling, "Let them in," and chanting, "Let them in" unison in large numbers about presumably Muslim immigrants, people who up until this point for a very long time had experienced intense discrimination, intense suspicion, and rejection at these ports of entry. They were really experiencing a shock at seeing the level of hospitality they were receiving. This not only obviously denotes some of the changing attitudes towards immigration throughout the world, in which people, again, are seeing immigration as something that is more positive, that is a strength to society, that is a strength to its economy, but also an indication of how public mobilization may operate to enhance this dilemma that I talk about immigration hospitality. And in previous periods, so throughout the book, I talk about within each period, the movements that countered anti-immigrant sentiment. And up until the travel ban, we see that the movements that counter anti-immigrant sentiment in the past often always came from communities who were marginalized and thus did not have power. And in my argument in the book, essentially what I am trying to argue is that the majority, the native population, has a moral responsibility towards the stranger that arrives at their shores. And it really takes mainstream, large-scale public acceptance of immigration hospitality for it to work. And oftentimes, I'm more cynical about journalism perhaps when it comes to covering Muslim immigrants. I actually think that the journalists who arrived at the airports were shocked by what they saw, and that shifted how they covered the Muslim travel ban and public response to it. So with that, I really hope that I've ended on a more positive note in terms of what the future of immigration hospitality in the United States, but in the world holds. And I look forward to hearing from all of you what questions you might have and what reflections you might have in light of this discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nour. This has been indeed a very, very interesting presentation. I personally enjoyed it, and I hope everyone else enjoyed it. I would like to take this instance to introduce myself to everyone, because I think I was so excited to start the webinar. I forgot to say that. So my name is Shireen Zaid. I'm a program coordinator and project development professional with experience in research that is based in Egypt. I currently work for the International Labor Organization in Egypt, but I have also been working with International Organization for Migration in Egypt, working basically on the community cohesion of migrants in their hosting communities. So basically, you have been saying and like hitting on a lot of points that we have been struggling with every single day in our day-to-day job. So I would just like to start perhaps by a couple of questions to ask you first before we move to everyone else questions. Everyone can actually put their questions in the chat box, and we are going to return back to it. But I just need to ask you, so because you focus so much on the media, and also you have been focusing so much on how you can actually, how much you need to look at the history before you try to explain the current situation. So there has been always this paradox of healthy migrant effect that basically suggests that immigrants have a health advantage over the domestic born in their hosting communities. However, a lot of media actually try always to frame immigrants as the contrary, as you said, like from actually comparing them to the disgusting images of animals, saying that they are actually carrying a lot of diseases to their hosting communities. So how can you explain this sort of unhealthy immigrant image that is being marketed and used to reject immigrants in their hosting communities?
That's an excellent question, and it's a really important one, especially for someone who cares about immigrant issues. It's a big dilemma. So what I found doing all this research on archives, essentially throughout the book, I talk about how I immersed myself in the New York Times archive, the Washington Post archive, but quite a lot of regional newspapers where there's big immigrant influxes. And you see this essentially, yes, a very contradictory situation where, first of all, you're right, there is a healthy migrant effect. And one of the reasons there's a healthy migrant effect is because migration is a difficult process. It's taxing for the body. Migrants tend to be younger. Sadly, unlike what Donald Trump said about Mexican immigrants, they don't send their best and brightest, they send us the criminals and the murderers and the drug dealers and this and that. Actually, ironically, yes, most countries that are hubs of immigration to the United States are sending their best and brightest. That's one of their problems. They're having a brain drain. So yes, these immigrants tend to be healthier, younger, hard workers. There is quite a lot also of economic indicators of how immigrants tend to establish companies more than the local population. Immigrants tend to be entrepreneurs. Immigrants tend to have a high sort of shift in terms of how much they're willing to learn and progress. So there's all these indicators. The problem that we find, and this is why I think having perhaps what I'm trying to build is some sort of toolkit for journalists, having a focus on facts being a driving force rather than, you know, what they end up finding is a sort of, let me go find a poor immigrant that fits the stereotype and do a story about them, even if they're not it's an anecdotal evidence situation, even though it's not representative of the broad swath of most immigrants. You know, I'm an immigrant myself. I'm Syrian. I am now a professor at a university in the UK, and I actually represent quite a lot of Arab immigration to the global north. But yet when I turn on the TV, the types of immigration that I see are not representative of that. So there's that element as well, is this important role, ethical role, and I talk about that a lot more about in my book, the ethical role that the journalist plays in representing reality, in eliciting compassion by simply, you don't have to do too much, but focus on the humanity of the immigrant. Don't represent them as huge numbers that are a horde, that are a threat. Represent them as human beings. Try to focus on what brings them together with the local population, rather than trying to focus so much on their otherness and their difference. For quite a lot of immigrants, there's very little you would actually identify them as different in a workplace. I mean, the regular immigrant to the UK or the US, they're almost indistinguishable from like a person who grew up there. It would be really hard to see an immigrant and go, you were born somewhere else. It doesn't work that way, especially in these settler colonial nations where everyone came from somewhere else. So there's that. And it's a very important question, because as we saw with COVID-19, for example, as we see we got lucky this time with the fact that the WHO immediately responded, but even then, there was an immediate sort of backlash toward immigrants. Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans in the US were beaten to death sometimes. Old ladies going shopping were beaten, all of which was because they were being blamed for bringing disease. And it continues, if you want to get immigration to the United States, you're assumed to be bringing typhoid. You still get tested for typhoid if you immigrate to the US today.
Wow. This is very interesting. And they are all facts, basically. And it is really a big question, and introduced the elephant in the room every single time we talk about the health related issues to migrants. But you also have mentioned something that's very important about how media is tackling this point, which brings me to my second question. And I promise afterwards I'll leave the room for the other people to ask you questions as well. But when we are talking about the behavior of the society itself, aside from the politicians, aside from the political leaders and everything, now the society, your neighbors basically, and everyone else that is within your hosting community itself, that plays a major factor in the welfare of the migrants that are living within this community. So how can media impact the change of behavior of these hosting communities to make it more welcoming to their neighboring, basically, migrants that live with them?
Thank you so much. It's an excellent question, and it's something that scholars are still working on. There's a lot of evidence that immigration coverage, but also coverage that deals with the other, that focuses on their humanity, that focuses on shared characteristics, tends to also lead to greater compassion and better sort of understanding for the circumstances. So that's very important. There's also the fact that in the end, media holds a responsibility to represent the value that the immigrant brings, rather than simply focusing on their sort of negative impact on society. For example, in Germany, there's plenty of evidence that the Syrian refugees that were brought in net actually contributed more to the GDP than they took. More importantly, that immigrants perhaps they're kind of like an investment in your future. They require a primary investment, but they actually return dividends for many years to come. This is especially important in countries where the birth rate is dropping, and there's a need for people to sustain the social security systems, the job markets. I mean, for example, there's one element here of Brexit and how Brexit was covered in terms of we need to take back our country, but no one actually directly explained to the public that Brexit means less immigrants, which I know you're celebrating now because you don't want immigration, but it will collapse your job market. And here we are, it's collapsed the job market. And the UK, for the first time in many, many years, is experiencing a collapse in the economy as a result. This is all related to Brexit. So I think there needs to be a conversation, an honest conversation from the media to the public, educating them on the rules, educating them on realities of the cost of bringing in a refugee and what they bring back to the society. And the last thing is, I talk a lot more in the book about the responsibility to protect. That post-World War II, the world responded to the atrocity that took place with a pact on immigration, the Geneva Convention, that we have legal requirements. So for example, when the United States says someone arrived as an illegal immigrant, they are not illegal. The United States is bound by international conventions to respect the fact that this person has the right to seek refuge. So the public is not aware of that. I had many conversations with members of the public over the course of this project, and they'd say things like they're illegal. And I'm like, do you know that the US has an agreement post-World War II? Oh, no, they had no idea. Well, that's also a failure of the media in terms of educating the public.
Okay, thank you so much for your answer. And it's definitely, it's very, very rich, and they carry a lot. Like, I'm really looking forward to read your book completely, all of it, from cover. But now I don't want to be any more selfish, and perhaps, like, if any of the audience would like to ask any question, they can raise their hands and they can join us. So anyone would like to ask a question from the audience? Let's see. I don't see any hands. Also, if you would feel more comfortable about leaving your question in the chat box, and we can ask Dr. Nour directly, we can also do that. So if you have any question about the webinar now, yeah, we have a question. Please, Dr. Ali, please join us.
Sure. Thank you, Nour. I was actually, I'm going to say a note and then I'm going to ask you a question. I was very pleased to hear your comment about the nature of some of the countries. You remember a few years back, there was a book by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. The title of the book is Not a Nation of Immigrants. And she was actually following on a previous book of hers called The Indigenous People History of the US.
Yeah.
And her justification actually is that the flag of Nation of Immigrants came actually at a later stage in the US, and it was really a justification to try to sort of let through behind us all the history we had. So this I think it's an interesting thing. But I want to sort of position this in a different way. Maybe instead of the US, let's look at Europe. Because when you talk about all the Mediterranean rim and Africa, I think the majority, their target is going to Europe, not going to the US. Mm-hmm. Now, when you talk about going to Europe, you can find lots of, I think you've addressed it as racial. Yes, it is racial. It is racial in many aspects. You've mentioned Syrians in Germany. I could tell you, I mean, the Germans opened the immigration and really took the cream of the cream. The engineers, the doctors, the brain power of Syrians who were seeking refuge. And then at the later stage, oops, we had our quota, we had enough. Then we started getting other less skillful players. I'll give you another interesting example. The UN has a higher office. There is a higher commissioner of human rights. The previous guy actually tweeted about, if you remember the Time magazine, there was a photo of Trump looking at a little girl. And there was an article about, because what this guy has done, they've actually detained parents of infants away from their children, which is a human rights violation. And the guy tweeted about this, and you can guess what happened to him. He was sacked. He was sacked like at the speed of light. So I mean, anyway, I mean, even when you look at France, for example, there are lots of sub-Saharan African. Now, as long as they win the World Cup, they are celebrated. If they are not winning the World Cup, so I just wanted to sort of, yes, it is probably mixed with racism. When you talk about immigrants from other countries, I mean, other quote unquote white countries to a white country, you don't get this kind of attention. They're easily mixed with the society. So it's not just that the guy is strange. No, it's really about, it's a different race. It's really ethnic. So I just want to hear your views. I mean, Europe, is it a different story than the US? I mean, the other part also interesting because lots of people talk, I mean, especially Algerians and France, for example. The Algerians talks about the atrocity that the French committed in Algeria, which is a fact. I mean, the French, when they wanted to test their atomic bomb, they did it in Algeria, which is, for God's sake. I mean, but anyway, so the point there is that even when you try to position it as that it's really you owe us because you siphon most of our resources, it doesn't carry a weight. Now, without getting into too much of a politics, I mean, you can understand that there are other groups, when they play this game, they can actually get much more rewards from it. So anyway, I just wanted to sort of get just to sort of steer the questions until the others warm up and hopefully join. Thank you.
I think thank you so much. These are very important conversations. No, I don't think Europe is fundamentally different. I do think there's some differences in Europe, i.e. it's not a settler colonial society, which changes the way in which immigration operates in Europe. But in the end, the people who are exercising this type of racial discrimination towards immigrants in the US are of European origin. So actually, there's a lot of similarity there. But, you know, as Sivanandan talks about, we are here because you were there. Essentially, these communities who are now in Europe are in Europe because Europe went ahead and colonized their parts of the world and extracted enormous amounts of wealth from their countries that now limits the economic development. So for example, you know, at the time, for example, that England colonized India, India represented something like 2/5 of the global economy. They stole all of that wealth. And yes, that in many ways stalls economic development in India for centuries. And so as a result, you see this massive immigration to the United Kingdom. And yes, you're right. In many ways, that is because they owe them. A lot of the wealth that is built in the United Kingdom is based on the backs of Indians who were expropriated or were sort of stolen. Their sort of national heritage, national treasures were stolen. I mean, the easiest representation is the current debate right now over the Koh-i-Noor diamond that may or may not appear in the coronation. And the big debate right now in the United Kingdom is over specifically South Asian origin immigrants to the UK who are now citizens feel really insulted by the use of the Koh-i-Noor because it sort of highlights the fact that these are all stolen wealth of their former countries, and that they're only here because that wealth was stolen and opportunities shrunk. This is replicated in most of Europe. So for France, you know, quite a lot of, I talk about how I've lived in almost every colonial system. I lived in countries that were colonized by the French, by the Dutch, and by the English. It's interesting how the methods of colonialism differ for each. And what they leave behind and how they extract is different. But yes, it's the same kind of relationship. You see a lot of Moroccan immigration in France, a lot of Levantine immigration in France. And part of that is that there is a sort of Francophone legacy that they left behind. But part of that is this element of, yeah, you've extracted wealth from these countries. You should expect some people to come here. And then lastly, of course, is this kind of I talk about it a bit more in chapter 5, is this inability to see the value of the immigrant in it as such. So for example, we have Zidane as a perfect example of this in France. When the immigrant does well and excels and in many ways does better than the average French person, it brings sort of a World Cup or some sort of value to the country, he is French. But when in any way the immigrant acts undesirably, he is now Algerian. And this is because there is an inability to see, and again, this is a very big problem. It's actually a bigger problem than simply media. This is actually even a problem in education. So even as a sort of Arab educator, I show up oftentimes to courses and I realize that for years, they have taught the students that the beginning of any civilization was the European Enlightenment movement, as opposed to any contribution that the Arab or Eastern world had contributed to these movements. So, things like Ibn Khaldun, things like the invention of algebra, things like you wouldn't have quite a lot of the repository of knowledge had the Arabs not translated and kept the contents of this science over time. All of that gets erased, and we educate young kids in the global north that civilization began with, enlightenment, European enlightenment, as opposed to sort of any history. And what happens then is we see these parts of the world as incapable of giving anything valuable. The people come from there who are just gonna extract from our society, but will never give something. And if they do well, it's because we made them that way. And if they do poorly, it's because their true nature has showed up. It's very complicated. It's really, really complicated. There's a conversation around the world on decolonizing curricula. So decolonizing education, so that students learn to see the world not simply through a Eurocentric lens where they invented the wheel, or where Europe excelled because Europe is exceptional, rather than Europe excelled because it stole the wealth of the entire world. I mean, come to the British Museum. It's really interesting. You just walk through the entire world expropriated of their history. And then the name on the building is the British Museum. I remember seeing the Rosetta Stone. I'm originally Syrian. The Rosetta Stone comes from my part of the world, and seeing it in the British Museum. And I can't see it, by the way, because it's so swamped by other people wanting to see it. And there's all this security. And I thought, what the irony of all of this, the Syrian who cannot see the item that comes from their part of the world in the British Museum. So yeah, it's a very complex question, and this is actually a question that begins with education before it begins. The problem, and I talk about this a bit more in the book, is that being hospitable is not simply saying we will integrate you. It is saying I have things to learn from you. That, let's say, the Egyptian immigrant who arrives in the United States has lessons to teach the native population, and that's very important. Not simply thinking that this is someone who's going to come be a leech on society, and if they achieve something, it's because we taught them, we made them better.
Well, thank you so much for this. I have a question here in the chat box. So the question goes as, how would you recommend that migration hospitality be communicated to Gen Y and Gen Z in the corporate world to better improve the ongoing situations, particularly in IOB, seeking and to ensure fair living standards in the first world countries like the UK and Europe? This is the first part of the question. And the person who's asked the question also says that they would like to address the fact that new residents in the UK have to register or don't have to register with the police depending on where they are coming from. So there is like some sort of information for like based on like your nationality, if you have to register with the police or not to register with the police department in the UK. And basically this is their question that is particularly focusing on Gen Y and Gen Z. This is very interesting.
a great question. I think I might actually flip this on its head, actually, as an educator who deals with Gen Z and Gen Y all the time. And this, again, is a very interesting situation that I think my students find very shocking when they come into my classes, is that I often find they have more to teach us than we have to teach them. In the sense that it feels to me like Gen Z specifically, but also Gen Y, are acutely aware of injustice and very mobilized to deal with the bigger questions facing society, from climate change to racism, immigration issues, and on and on. So when you come to a college campus in the United States, but across the world, you find that the youngest people on campus are oftentimes the most vocal and the most mobilized about dealing with these issues. I think one of the other pieces of evidence we have towards that is polling. So when we poll people and ask in thousands, again, not anecdotal evidence, large scale evidence, we find that the anti-immigrant sentiment goes down as age goes down, and that the youngest generation is actually very pro-immigrant. So that also changes the equation. If anything, it would be great to have more Gen Z representation in the media, to have more Gen Z journalists and politicians, because actually that might shift the conversation a little bit to the interests of young people. They're going to inhabit the world longer than the folks who are currently, if you look at the current political makeup in the United States, we really have people who probably will sort of be in power for the next 10 years of their lives, but also those are the last 10 years of their lives. So it's really interesting. So yeah, I do think there is an element of communicating, educating Gen Z on issues, but at the very same time, there is a very heightened feel among that generation, very heightened compassion for people who are suffering all around the world. And oftentimes I'm very pleasantly surprised dealing with young people lately. So it's a happy thing. And then there was a second question, right? What was the second question?
So the second part of the question is...
Yes, registering. Yes.
Yeah, but they are talking about like the how we can ensure fair living standards in first world countries like the UK and Europe. And I think this touches upon like a very important point. I mean, like I will talk from my perspective as an Egyptian, and I did, yeah, and I did actually part of my master's in Germany, and we had to do like registration in the Bürgeramt, and we had to like go through everything, like if you are here with family and your religion, and I remember like just a funny small fact is that when I was registering, and I look like a Muslim. I mean, like it's quite obvious. So like it's all over me, and like she's like, yeah, I'm going to register you as an atheist, and I was wondering why, and it was basically because I would pay a fee if I was actually confirming that I'm a Muslim, and because I was a student and really had bare minimum living standards, like God would forgive me, I'll be an atheist for today. So yeah, this is just like a funny situation that happened in the middle. I think it somehow collides with this point. So your insight would be very valuable about this part.
I think, the point you're suggesting is really important. I think there is an issue here that continues to this day from the 1920s onwards. And actually there's another, oh my goodness, I'm forgetting her last name, Ruth something about, I'll remember shortly. But there's this element of always viewing the immigrant with suspicion, and thinking that the immigrant is a threat, is a criminal, and specifically when it comes from certain countries, meaning Middle Eastern countries, specifically countries where they are majority Muslim. So, of course, there are a lot of Christians in the Middle East, but they get lumped in, and we talk about the racialization of Islam, i.e. anyone who's Middle Eastern becomes Muslim to these laws and vice versa. So oftentimes what we find is we see this kind of treatment of the immigrant who comes from these countries as, oh, they must be a terrorist. And so, for example, similar to what you're suggesting, what our viewer is suggesting, I had to register with the police, and you have like it's a very difficult process. You have 5 days. And if you don't register with the police within 5 days, you can get deported. And again, this is this vision of you must be a huge threat. We need to know where you are at all times. You cannot move house without registering with the police within those 5 days of moving. And ironically, they also set up the system to jeopardize basically the immigration of all these people, because it's very difficult to get slots. So what ends up happening is you call them and they say, we have availability 3 months from now because we're underfunded, the office that you register with. And so legally, you now can get deported at any point, and not because of any fault of your own, but because the Office of Registration is so underfunded and busy and understaffed that you can't register. Ironically, something also funny happened in my situation where they didn't give me an appointment for a very long time. And then midway through my whole process, I became American. So full disclosure, I did get naturalized at some point in writing this book. And I actually write in the book about what happens when you're navigating the immigration system and you see how contradictory it is. So midway through the situation, I get naturalized. So I contact the police office and I say, well, now I'm American. They say, oh, perfect. Congratulations, by the way. And now you don't have to register. Okay, I'm the same human being. I have the same ideas. I have the same political values. Nothing has changed about me whatsoever. Besides your assumption previously that because I am Syrian, I must be big question mark. We need to know where she is at all times. Now they don't need to know where I am, it's very ironic. It's just deeply ironic.
It's very, very ironic. I can definitely hear you on this point. Well, I mean, this has also been like an amazing discussion about this point. I'm now trying to see if anyone else have any other questions that they would like to share with us. This is your best chance, whether by chat or like by raising your hands.
I do have one question in the chat that I received. It says, any insight about the history of Egyptian hospitality for immigration? That's really interesting. I actually didn't look at that, but it would be worth someone doing a research project that traces hospitality from perhaps even from ancient Egypt, because Egypt is very interesting because it has a lot of different sort of Arab, African, ancient Egyptian sort of cultural threads that weave through the conversation. But I bet there could be a project there if there is a master's or PhD student listening who would like to do it. I will gladly supervise that one. But yes, there is something there. So in the book, I look at multiple different traditions, but I don't look at any one of them in explicit, very deep detail. I put everything from hadith to Christian traditions to Jewish traditions to Hindu, Jain, all sorts of different ones, specifically that are relevant to American society, i.e. there are people who are American who come from these backgrounds. But yeah, it's applicable to any society. I could really imagine someone doing something on Egypt that's in depth. It would be wonderful.
Well, I have a tiny little bit thing maybe to add here. Ironically, I think this is why also Dr. Ali was like discussing this thing with me before, is because there was a research before that I did with a very interesting lady called Paula Pachi. She is the Deputy Chief of Mission of IIM Tunisia. And it's basically on media and the impact of community cohesion on economic development. So this is like a tiny bit of thing. I think it can be complementary and perhaps we can work together maybe one day to make it bigger.
I would love that.
Yes. Thank you so much. But also I think I have read some interesting articles that was published by the GMDAC, the Global Migration Data Analysis Center, that is ironically in Germany, because they have a lot of data sets, I guess. I'll be very neutral here. But yeah, it would be very interesting actually to see like also like if there are interested scholars that are on the ground to actually collect the data and work on it, would be very, very interesting in that sense. I am checking the chat box and I see nothing here. Oh, wait, I think there is I think there is something. Yes. So I think we are already actually run out of time 8 minutes ago, but because it was an amazing and very interesting discussion. And I'm really, really grateful, and personally actually grateful that I have been on this webinar with you. Thank you so much for your time and your amazing research and presence, and also like the openness to discuss all of these points at this time. I'm really, really thank you for this amazing book. We are all looking forward to read it through.
Thank you all so much. I couldn't have picked a better interlocutor, Shireen. You have been wonderful, and I really look forward. Hopefully we can keep in touch and we can maybe mount some large-scale projects, because I think there's a huge opportunity here for academics to work with the community, to work with different organizations, to work with journalists. I think there's a huge opportunity there. And for sort of global North and global South collaborations on research and interventions would be great. I would also like to thank our audience, who was brilliant. We had some great questions, and I look forward to hearing from all of you. I know, Dr. Ali, thank you for the invitation for this webinar, and I know that you'll be able to share my email and contact details. So if anyone wants to connect and ask further questions, I know we ran out of time, we can do that as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Ali, for this amazing opportunity. Would you like to come for any like fun remarks before we close this webinar?
No, I just wanted to thank Nour. It has been really very enlightening, and it shows the multi-angle that you should look at when you talk about the complex problem like migration and maybe even refugees. And I thank you, Shireen, for a very capable moderation. And I thank the audience for staying a little bit beyond the time. And again, we will share the Nour's contact information and even the slides if she sent it to us today. Perfect. Thank you again, everyone. Thanks. It's been fantastic.
Everyone.
Thank you so much. Have a great night.